Hello and welcome back to another video. Today I've got something pretty new but pretty important. We're going to be taking a detailed look at the tier 8, the tier 9 and the tier 10 tanks for the upcoming double-barreled British heavy tank tech tree. This new tech tree is going to be coming in January 2025, so less than a month basically, and I'm going to give you a pretty comprehensive review of each tank. So we're going to start off with the tier 8, move on to the tier 9, and then the tier 10. So, the tier 8 is called the FV227 Conceiver, and it looks kind of very similar to the Carnarvon, the tier 8 British heavy tank part of the Super Conqueror line, and you're going to see a trend as we look at these tanks. So, statistically, this tank is pretty okay, but there are definitely some downsides. So, it's going to have 280 alpha. Penetrations are pretty low for a tier 8, unfortunately. 219mm AP standard is really low, and you will feel that. 248 APCR is also really low, and you will feel that, especially when you do fight tier 8s and tier 10s. 248mm of penetration is just not great anymore, unfortunately. Shell velocities are okay, kind of not the most important statistic though. The reload time of 7.1 seconds is good, which means you're going to be reloading and firing 280 alpha relatively regularly. 2.2 seconds aim time is quite nice, and 0.35 dispersion is also okay for a tier 8 heavy tank. So, it's important to note here, when we're talking about these double-barreled heavy tank statistics, they have some slight alterations depending on which mode it's in. So, these heavy tanks have two modes, single fire mode and double shot mode. So, in single shot mode, these are the statistics you see here. Black and white, unchanged. However, when you switch to the double barreled mode, which works through a 2-second switch time that you don't have to stop for, and you continue your reload through. So, say for example, you fired one shot, you want to switch to your double barrel mode, you press the button, it switches, and then your next shot is 2. Okay? So you don't fire 1 round, you fire 2 rounds, and essentially all that it does to your statistics is it doubles your reload. So whilst you're in this double-barreled mode, your reload is not 7.1 seconds, it's 14.2 seconds. Your alpha is not 280, it's 560. So essentially it turns your tank from having a 280 alpha shot that's for 7.1 seconds reload to a tank that has a 560 alpha shot for a 14.2 seconds reload. That's basically what it does. However, you do pay in some kind of way in terms of statistics. So, you see an increase to your aim time, and you see an increase to your dispersion. We'll have a detailed look at that in a second. And you also do pay in terms of speed. So forward speed, you kind of pay a cost for it. So it's not kind of you switch to that mode and you just gain that. You do have to pay for it in some way. But looking at this tank's other statistics aren't affected by the mode changes. 10 degrees of gun depression, absolutely typical now for tier 8 British, just for British tanks in general, to be honest with you. 1600 hit points. That's a nice amount, but kind of average for tier 8 heavies. Armor, we can't get a detailed idea of this tank's armor because it is not on tanks.gg yet. However, on paper, 280mm turret is really quite nice. It looks quite angular. However, there are some flat areas around the gun which may be weak points, but we will have to see. This thing's hull looks pretty weak. Its lower plate is huge, which is probably going to be really, really weak. And it doesn't look particularly angled, so probably 120 is probably 120 in real life as well. So, let's now have a look at this tank's comparison. So, this is where we're going to see, in red, those statistics when we're in our double-barreled mode. So, the FV227 Conceiver compared to the Carnarvon. So, the Carnarvon has higher DPM. The Conceiver, slightly less. So, it's 2,366 for the Conceiver compared to 2,695 for the Carnarvon. Slightly worse, but it's okay. We see our alpha. Our alpha in single shot mode is identical between the two tanks. However, when we're in our double barreled mode, it's doubled. We know that already. So our reload time is slightly higher base for the Conceiver at 7.1 seconds, which does give us that lower DPM compared to the 6.23 for the Carnarvon. And we see that doubled reload time, 14.2 seconds, when we're in our double barreled mode. So the dispersion and aim time is where this gets interesting. So, our base dispersion, 0.35, is okay. It isn't as good as the Carnarvon's 0.33, however. The aim time between the Conceiver and the Carnarvon, pretty much identical. However, when we do switch to that double-barreled mode, our dispersion becomes 1.15 and our aim time becomes 3.36. A significant increase. So, this basically forces the double-barrel mode to be used exclusively at close range. You can't be going around using 1.15 dispersion at 400 meters. You will just be basically blowing your own brains out because it won't be fun. So this forces you to use it at less than 100 meters, basically, even maybe less than 50. So that is definitely interesting, but we can see how the speed is impacted. 34 forward standard, which is identical to the Carnarvon's, 12 in reverse, once again identical to Carnarvon's. However, our forward speed becomes 12 when we switch to that double barrel mode. So, once again, kind of forcing you to use it in a opportunistic way at close range. So say, for example, you have an opponent, you're one shot, you have an opponent that's in front of you, and you want to peek him and make sure you kill him in one shot. He's 520 HP. That is where this double barrel mode would be really great. You peek out, maybe he bounces you, maybe he low rolls you, you kill him. You use it in that kind of scenario where you need that higher alpha because it doesn't impact your DPM. Because essentially all you're doing is just doubling your reload. It is for double the alpha. It isn't doing anything else in terms of the reload time or the alpha. There's no like waiting time. So it essentially just doesn't affect the DPM. So it increases the flexibility of the tank, let's put it that way. So let's compare the other statistics. 10 degrees of gun depression, identical for the two. Identical HP values. The armor, the hull armor is slightly worse for the Conceiver. However, we saw that lower plate is huge. The Carnarvon's isn't that big. Interestingly, the Carnarvon has a decent turret, which works pretty effectively. The Conceiver is on paper going to have a stronger turret, but it did look flatter in certain areas. So we'll see how that works effectively at tier 8. Maybe it's weak to tier 9 only, and maybe just tier 10 butters it, but we'll have to see. And penetration-wise, the Conceiver has worse penetration overall. Only 1 millimeters less on the standard, but 4 millimeters less on the gold. So not great. So that's the tier 8. Let's now have a look at the tier 9. The tier 9 is called the FV229 Contender. So you can kind of see a trend with the names here. This tank's model, unfortunately, does look really bad at the minute because it isn't finished. So do ignore the kind of leopard print model design. It is just kind of unfinished. So let's have a look at this thing's statistics. So 390 alpha, so that is an increase from the tier 8, 280 to 390. We're seeing a significant increase in penetrations here. So 248 millimeters base, which is the tier 8 gold penetration. And we're seeing 303 millimeters gold. That's really okay for tier 9. Kind of being able to have gold that goes above 300 is passable, especially for a tier 9 heavy. The shell velocities are good, but once again, that's kind of less than relevant. Our reload time is 11 seconds, so when we apply that same logic, which we did to the tier 8, in double-barreled mode, that becomes 22 seconds. Our aim time is 2.2 seconds base. We'll have a look at it in double-barreled mode in a second. And once again, the 0.35 dispersion. That is kind of okay for a tier 9 heavy tank. Same with our aim time, 2.2 base. That's kind of okay. We've got our standard 10 degrees of gun depression. It's quite slow. And that's something I didn't quite mention for the tier 8. They aren't quick, these tanks. 34 forwards, which is the kind of same for the tier 8 and the tier 9. You are going to want to run a turbo on this tank. And important to note, you can't, and as far as we're aware, you cannot run a gun rammer on these tanks. Same way as you can't on the 7032, for example. So being able to run a turbo is okay because you're not having to, you have one equipment less dependent, so you can run a turbo. But you will want to run a turbo. Our HP is good. 2000 HP pool is really nice. And then let's look at our armor on paper. 280 millimeters for the turret again looks okay. However, this tank has a pretty big cupola, which looks very similar to, for example, the Super Conquerors. Probably will work very similar. And it does look quite flat, and it does have an interesting underflap, which might be really weak, or might be an auto ricochet, auto pen angle. Similar to the Iron Arnie, the tier 8 American medium tank, people know that. You shoot it under its flaps and it ricochets down and pens the top of the hull. Maybe that will be an issue on this tank, but we'll have to see. But it does look pretty flat, so maybe it's not going to be 280mm in all areas, maybe only in certain. And this thing, once again, has a pretty large lower plate, but maybe it's got some interesting thick angles on it, because it's got some thicker bits towards the side of the tracks, and it does look really strangely shaped, so maybe it's only 165 in the middle. And once again, for the hull, the upper hull, it does look pretty weak, pretty flat in areas, but once again, some more angled, some more thick areas, so we'll have to see. But let's now compare this tank to the Conqueror, the tier 9 British Super Conqueror line tank. You'll see a trend here. So our DPM is worse. So the Contender, the FE229 is worse, has worse DPM than the Conqueror, 2127 compared to 2515. We have 10 less alpha, 390 compared to 400. However, I haven't quite included it on here. Do remember that alpha is doubled for 780 instead of 400 when we're 390 when we're in our double barreled mode. Our reload is slightly worse for the Contender, which does give us that change in DPM when we combine that with a slightly lower alpha. So 11 seconds compared to 10.8 for the Conqueror, and that reload time is doubled once again, 11 seconds to 22 seconds for our double barreled mode. Our base dispersion is 0.35, which is worse than the Conqueror's 0.32, and our aim time of base 2.2 seconds compared to the Conqueror's 1.82. This tank's gun handling will feel worse than the Conqueror's. However, the Conqueror does have just beautiful gun handling. That is one of its kind of party tricks. The Conqueror has lovely gun handling at tier 9. The Contender, unfortunately, isn't going to have such nice gun handling, but 0.35 and 2.2 definitely isn't terrible and is manageable. However, once again, when we switch to our double-barreled mode, we do see a massive increase in our dispersion and aim time, once again forcing us to play this tank at close range. Interestingly, it seems, and I'm seeing a trend here, and I'm not 100% sure if this is going to change, that when you switch to double-barreled mode, all of the tanks gain the same dispersion and aim time. So that's the tier 8 Premium, the tier 8 Tech Tree, the tier 9 Tech Tree, and the tier 10 Standard Tech Tree. They seem to all gain 1.15 dispersion, 3.36 aim time. Their speeds obviously changed by a coefficient based upon their base speeds, but the dispersion and aim time seem to be fixed to 1.15 and 3.36. So that might be kind of predictable, but we'll have to wait and see. But once again, forces you to play at close range. The speed for this tank is identical forwards to the Conqueror and also the tier 8, 34, 34, 34. However, you don't pay as much in terms of forward speed as you do for the tier 8 when you switch modes, 16 and 13 in reverse. The Conquerors and the Contender's gun depression is identical. The Contender, interestingly, has 50 extra HP. Kind of nice. We can see that the Contender has, on paper, better hull armor than the Conqueror. The Conqueror's lower plate is butter, and maybe the Contender's lower plate, as we saw, is actually a little bit more bouncy, but we'll have to wait and see. Obviously, it's not on Tanks.gg yet. And interestingly, on paper, it has a thicker turret. However, I do have my doubts as to whether it's going to be as effective as the Conqueror's, due to it having that potentially an auto ricochet angle and pretty flat armor in places. Interestingly, penetration-wise, the Contender is now significantly worse than the Conqueror. 248mm base is significantly worse than the Conqueror's 259mm base. And its gold penetration of 303 is significantly worse than the Conqueror's 326. So the Conqueror does have really nice penetration values, especially that standard. But the Contenders will be manageable, just not the greatest at the same time. So that's the tier 9, the FE229 Contender. Let's have a look now, finally, at the FE230 Canopener. This tank has got a hilarious name, and it's going to be the top of the tree, the tier 10, the creme de la creme of this new British double-barreled line. And I think it looks bloody gorgeous. I don't know, I am British, as you can probably tell by my funny accent, so I do feel a little bit happier and a little bit kinder towards British tanks, but I think this tank looks pretty cool. But yeah, you can argue with me in the comments. I will also argue back. Do bear that in mind, though. But let's have a look at this thing's statistics now. So this is going to have 420 alpha. And once again, a slight increase over the previous tiers. Our penetration, however, has not increased as much. So we're only gaining 258mm of penetration, standard AP, and 318mm gold APCR. Unfortunately, that does mean that, for example, the Tier 9 Conqueror, the Super Conqueror line's Tier 9, has better penetration than the Tier 10 new one here. Not great. This thing's penetration will feel really quite poor, and you will feel it, especially when you're playing against more heavily armored opponents, like an E100, for example. Shell velocities are good. Once again, not the most important statistic. Our reload time is 10 seconds. Remember, that gets doubled to 20 seconds when we're in our double barreled mode. Our base aim time is 2 seconds. That's really quite nice, actually, base. And our base dispersion is 0.33. Once again, that's also really quite nice. Remember, we're probably going to make, and we're going to make a little bit of an assumption here, that aim time becomes 1.15, and that aim time becomes 3.36, and that dispersion becomes 1.15. So, once again, aim time 3.36, dispersion 1.15 when we switch that mode. So, obviously increasing from the base, which I think is kind of okay, and if it's predictable, I think that's okay. But once again, you are going to be heavily limited to being short range, as close to your opponents, and using it in an opportunistic manner. We've got our standard 10 degrees of gun depression. Interestingly, we're slightly slower forwards here than the Tier 8 and the Tier 9, 32 forwards, but slightly quicker in reverse. 32 forwards, 14 in reverse. We have a really nice HP pool here of 2,400. With a hardening, that's pulling it up to 2,600, especially if we're using a bond hardening. And our armor is looking okay. This thing looks like it has a pretty small lower plate, which is a little bit different than the Tier 8 and the Tier 9. However, its hull looks not the most angled, and it does have this kind of 60 TP-esque driver's hatch on the front. So maybe that will be a pretty big weak point, but once again, it's not on tanks.gg yet, so we can't really get a good idea. But it says on paper it's 200mm, so that's not going to be the strongest. So maybe this thing's going to be pretty weak as a hull, but maybe it can be angled and be slightly better. This thing's turret on paper is actually worse than the Tier 8 and the Tier 9, so 260mm, and it does look pretty flat. However, this thing's gun mantlet is bloody huge, so maybe it's okay when it is using its 10 degrees of gun depression, and as we can see, it doesn't look like it has a pretty big cupola. So maybe it's going to kind of rely on being hull down, and if you're not, it's going to be pretty weak. But once again, unfortunately, we can't get a really good idea. So, let's now compare this tank to the Super Conqueror. So as you can see, throughout this, I've kind of compared these tanks to the already British heavy tank line in the game. Because, as you'll kind of notice, every single one of them is just a slightly worse equivalent of the already British heavy tank line. So, the Tier 8 new one is slightly worse than the Carnarvon. The Tier 9 new one, slightly worse than the Conqueror. And the Tier 10 new one, yeah, as you're probably going to see, is slightly worse than the Super Conqueror. Obviously, in the Super Conqueror's nerf state. Which is still okay. So, DPM-wise, the Canopener is worse off, 2,520 compared to 2,607, but interestingly much closer than the Tier 8 comparison and the Tier 9 comparison. It has higher alpha, 420 compared to 400. That's quite nice. The reload time, the Conqueror has better reload, which gives it the better DPM. But we see the Canopener's base reload of 10 seconds doubling to 20 seconds when we are in our double-barreled mode. Interestingly, our gun handling is a lot closer than previous comparisons. So 0.33 for the Canopener compared to 0.32 for the Super Conqueror. That's quite nice. That base gun handling is going to be quite comfortable. Aim time of 2 seconds for the Canopener compared to 1.92 for the Super Conqueror. Quite close. Going to be quite nice, especially for a Tier 10 heavy. However, we have once again, when we're in our double-barreled mode, got that predictable esque kind of gun handling of 1.15 dispersion and 3.36 base aim time. So, once again, forcing you to play close range and in an opportunistic manner. Interestingly, our forward speed is slightly worse for the Canopener than the Conquerors, for the Super Conquerors, 34. But we can see a slightly less vicious kind of payment when you're in the double-barreled mode compared to the Tier 8 and the Tier 9 in terms of speed. 20 forward, which is okay. And we don't quite know whether this is going to be affected by a turbo yet, but I'd assume so. Gun depression, both have 10 degrees, the Canopener and the Conqueror. Interestingly, the Canopener has 100 extra HP. As I said, 2,400 is really quite nice compared to the Super Conqueror's 2,300. Armor on paper, this Canopener is going to have significantly better hull armor than the Super Conqueror on paper, but you know, we can't quite get an idea of how much better and if it is actually on paper, in reality, sorry, going to be better. The Super Conqueror's turret is 279mm. Obviously, it just has some weak points. The Canopener is probably going to have similar weak points by looking at it, but 260mm probably means those weak points are going to be slightly weaker. Interestingly, the penetration-wise, the standard penetration for the Canopener is only 1mm worse than the Super Conqueror, so 258 compared to 259. However, the Super Conqueror's gold penetration of 326 is relatively significantly better than the Canopener's 318 gold penetration. So, as we can kind of see the trend here, the tier 8, here we go, we can pull it up here. So the tier 8 FV227 Conceiver is slightly worse than the Carnarvon, the tier 8 already in the game. The tier 9 FV229 Contender is slightly worse than the already tier 9 in the game, the Conqueror. And the FV230 Canopener, the new top of the tree creme de la creme British double-barreled heavy, is just going to be slightly worse than the Super Conqueror. Do I think that's a bad thing? No, I definitely do not. This thing has a gimmick that has the potential to give these tanks more flexibility. And I feel flexibility kind of makes up, to an extent, the difference in these tank statistics. Not 100% makes up the difference, but to an extent, giving these tanks more flexibility to kind of use that higher alpha shot in a pressure situation where that higher alpha shot may allow you to kill that tank and may surprise that tank that you are fighting against. I think that's important, and I think that's going to be where these tanks kind of have more flexibility. Obviously, being worse on paper statistically is not great, but I don't think it's the end of the world, and I actually like the fact that Wargaming have been a little bit tentative with these tanks. Do I think these tanks are going to be terrible? No, I very much do not. Do I think we're seeing a repeat of the Type 71 incident of last year? No, I do not. I think these tanks are going to be good, and a good player will be able to make these tanks work. Definitely, for sure. These tanks are going to be, these tanks are going to be really nice to see in game, and it's going to be something new, but also not entirely new, because we obviously do already have double-barreled tanks in the game, but this is just double-barreled tanks with a British flavour. So, that's my opinions on this new British heavy tank line. I'm excited for them. I will probably be going for them pretty quickly, but that's probably my British bias. But do let me know down in the comments what you think about each tank. Do you agree that the tier 8 is slightly worse? Do you agree that the tier 9, once again, is slightly worse? And maybe do you disagree with me and think that this new tier 10 FV230 Canopener is going to be better than the Super Conqueror? But do let me know down in the comments what your thoughts and opinions on this are. If you did enjoy this video, don't forget to check out the videos on screen, like and subscribe, and I'll see you all again very soon.